Good evening. I want to welcome everybody to the Strand. I hope you enjoy our new event space, which is located in our rare book floor. As a way of introduction, I'm Nancy Wyden. I'm the owner of the Strand. The Strand was founded by my grandfather in 1927. It's been around for 3 generations of my family. So, contrary to the so-called experts who say the Kindles and the iPads and the next cool devices are going to wipe out bookstores, we believe that people do not want to just be sitting home at home tethered to their gadgets, even though I see Matt brought his device to the bookstore. But we're just planning to serve the book community for a long, long time. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome back Nomi Prins for the launch of her first historical novel, Black Tuesday. This is the second time that she's been at the Strand, and she says that she only signs at independent bookstores. Love her for that. So with the mounting frustration with Wall Street and the recession, this novel and topic is extremely timely. So this, and special thank you to Demos, the nonpartisan multi-issue think tank, for co-sponsoring this event, and they're located here in New York City. So we have a lively group of panelists here tonight, none of which are afraid of controversy, including Matt Taibbi. Okay. And Rich Benjamin, that's a lot easier, who'll talk about the current financial climate. Black Tuesday is a character-driven book that vividly portrays New York on the cusp of the great stock market crash of 1929. It captures the romance and desperation of one of the most fascinating historical times. Nomi Prins left a lucrative career at Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns after a decade to pen 3 nonfiction whistleblower books, It Takes a Pillage, Other People's Money, and Jacked, exposing fraud and deception from Wall Street to Washington. Her first novel, The Trail, is a thriller set in the corrupt banking world, and it was written under a pseudonym. You'll have to tell us why. But she's a senior fellow at Demos and a frequent commentator for all kinds of media, PBS, Fox, MSNBC, CNBC, CNN, BBC, and other global media outlets. Matt is a contributing editor for Rolling Stone. He writes about politics and finance. In one article, he famously described Goldman Sachs as a great vampire squid wrapped about the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. He's authored 5 books, many of which we have here, including the New York Times bestseller, Great Derangement and Griftopia. And he's recently became a contributor for Current TV's Countdown with Keith Olbermann. Rich Benjamin, down at the end, is the author, of Searching for Witopia, an improbable journey to the heart of white America, which was the winner of 2009 Editor's Choice Award from Booklist and the American Library Association. Rich regularly appears all over the media, including on NPR, MSNBC, C-SPAN, New York Times, USA Today, and CNN.com. He's a contributing producer of short documentaries for Time.com in partnership with CNN, and he's a senior fellow at Demos. So for a little bit of tonight's format, we're going to have a conversation. Then we want to open up the mic to your questions. It's a really big crowd here, so if you don't mind just standing up, and I'll hand you and just waiting a second for me to hand you the mic so everybody can hear you. And then the authors are going to stick around and sign copies of their books. Also, a special thanks to C-SPAN for filming tonight and for the work they do to inspire and educate us. So please join me in welcoming some of America's great contemporary whistleblowers and advocates of financial reform, Nomi Prins and her panelists to the Strand. Thank you all.
Hi, my name is Rich Benjamin. I'm a senior fellow at Demos. And first of all, I'd like to welcome you guys who make this event possible. And I want to thank Strand, such a beloved institution for we book lovers here in New York. And I want to thank Demos, which, as Nancy mentioned, is a multi-issue think tank which works for 3 overarching goals. The first of which is a more equitable, prosperous economy. The second of which is a democracy where more of us can participate. And the third of which is a public sector that works for the common good. Now, I want to offer a different angle in introducing our other panelists. I got this email in July from Nomi, and it said, "Hey, Rich, I've written a novel called Black Tuesday." Right here. And I'm thinking, word? Nomi wrote a book about African American Tuesday. She had to clarify. Black Tuesday, of course, referring to Dark Tuesday in the stock market crash of 1929. And immediately I could see the timeliness of this topic. Although Nomi could write a book called African American Tuesday. Now, for those of you who don't know, Nomi is such a dogged, incisive, elegant voice for progressive values. And I'm so honored to introduce her. What you may not know, and which was alluded to before, is Nomi was part of the 1% before she joined the 99%. Nomi was a Wall Streeter, and not only was she a Wall Streeter, she was a managing director at Goldman Sachs, which is such an achievement in itself in terms of her brilliance. But now she's based in LA, and she's writing full-time, and I want to briefly show you her novels because that really gives a wonderful trajectory of her thinking and her career. The first, Other People's Money, The Corporate Mugging of America. Secondly, Jacked, How Conservatives Are Picking Your Pocket, whether you voted for them or not. Third whistleblowing book, It Takes a Pillage, Behind the Bailouts, Bonuses, and Backroom Deals from Wall Street to Washington. By the way, Nomi's also the queen of titles, in case you hadn't noticed. So you can learn more about Nomi at www.nomiprins.com. And I just introduced her with a great deal of pride and a great deal of affection, and we miss her here on the right coast. So Nomi Prins.
Thank you.
Now, Matt Taibbi. You might figure, you know, Matt's a bit of an underachiever and a boring writer. Seriously, Matt is a regular contributor for Rolling Stone, and he has made such a name to really exposing the underbelly and the dark side of our financial institutions in this country. You read the beautiful quote that Matt had to say about Nomi's former employer, Goldman Sachs. And I'll briefly read from Matt's blog today. You can find Matt at his Rolling Stone blog when he's not on Countdown. Matt wrote today, quote, "What nobody is comfortable with is a movement in which virtually the entire spectrum of middle class and poor Americans is on the same page, railing against incestuous political and financial corruption on Wall Street and in Washington. The reality is that Occupy Wall Street and the millions of middle Americans who make up the Tea Party are natural allies and should be on the same page about most of the key issues, and that's a story our media won't want you to know or you to handle." I have a gripe to pick with Matt. As Nancy mentioned, I published a book called Searching for Whitopia in 2009, An Improbable Journey to the Heart of White America. In 2010, Matt released Griftopia. Bubble machines, vampire squids, and the long con that is breathtaking, that is breaking America. So please visit Matt and welcome Matt. And Matt, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you. Sorry to steal the title.
So let's just begin. Let's just jump right in. What we'll do is we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions. And Nomi, let's hear about Black Tuesday.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Nancy, for that lovely introduction. Thank the Strand. Thank Demos. Thank the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, where I spent a lot of time and took a lot of tours doing some of the research for this book. Thank your grandfather for 2 years before the time that this book took place, starting this bookstore. Because a lot has happened, and it's wonderful to gather here tonight for that. Obviously, a lot going on in the world with respect to, and particularly in New York on Wall Street and so forth, that Rich is talking about, that Matt talks about with respect to what is an uprising amongst people who are just sick of the way things are economically and want it to actually be different, not to have talk about how it might be different, but to actually live differently. And we are, I'm sure, going to talk about that a lot tonight. But what I want to do first is take you back 82 years to a period in time that was both very different and very similar to today. And that was part of my inspiration for coming up with the story for this book, is that a lot of what I do, what Rich does, what Matt does, you know, we talk about numbers, we do talk about people, we talk about stats, but it's really in a novel that you can also look at the emotions behind that, the sort of the sheer humanity of struggling and of what you bear and what you think you don't want to deal with and what you ultimately come to achieve. And there's a lot of that in this book too. No one's a natural hero, least of all the main character, Lila Khan. She comes to what she ultimately does in this book through a lot of internal struggle and a lot of different situations. I'm going to read 3 brief passages from the book to give you a sense of you know, what she went through, what things were like on both sides of the divide, the 1% and the 99%, but back then. And it wasn't too different, and go from there. So the first passage, Lila lives in this 5th floor walk-up on Orchard Street in an apartment that she shares with 4 other people. Her old aunt Rosa, her little sister Rachel, and her 2 cousins. And it's tiny and cramped, as you can imagine, back in the 20s, back in that day, back at that time. And she's having a conversation with her aunt about this idealism that she's seeing, the sort of activism that's kind of happening amongst the workers and the people she knows on that side, and how she really feels about it, which is not sure. Lila eyed her aunt's hollow cheekbones and defiant limbs, the silver streaks in the wiry raven hair that she wore braided down her back. She felt her throat constrict. "Listen to me go on," said Rosa with a labored flick of her wrist. "Of course things will be fine. Enough with this source. How are things with you and Nelson?" "Fine," answered Lila. "That's all? Just fine?" "I don't know. I wish he could be happier. He's always going on about how miserable things are, or fighting about something, ever since his brother was shot. I'm afraid he may join the gangs again. I guess I'm tired of it. I'm tired of not being the fighter he thinks I should be." Rosa nodded and swayed her body back and forth. Her eyes closed as they transported her to the internal movie of her past. "He's a good man with a loyal heart. You should try to see where he's coming from." Should. Rosa's words made Lila feel inadequate. She could not help but think of the stranger at the Morning Spot. The Morning Spot's a diner down on Wall Street. Did he have any warmth, any goodness? She knew nothing about him, and yet he had somehow burrowed into her heart. "I know," replied Lila, but that won't make him easier to deal with. "You remember what I told you when you first came here? A young girl of 14 not knowing a word of English," she asked. "I do, Tanta." Lila braced herself for a speech she'd heard many times before. It was her duty to listen diligently, but her heart impelled her to flee. She loved her aunt with all her being, but that love imposed a burden that she wished she could shake. "I told you that in order to succeed in America, you must find your purpose and always help those less fortunate than you." "I know, which is exactly what Nelson strives to do every day. I know. It's just that you and he have such courage, such patience. I wish I did. Instead, I just want to get out of here." Lila stopped herself, but Rosa seemed to understand exactly what she meant. "Sometimes you don't find your cause, Lila," said her aunt with a little smile. "Your cause finds you. There is a little fight buried in all of us." And that's kind of one of the messages in the book, is that, you know, not all of us start out knowing anything about the direction of our life, or fights we might have, or how we might react in those particular situations. I mean, certainly when I started on Wall Street, I was Lila's age. I was 19. And I had no idea what it was about. And it took me working there many, many years to finally figure it out, and ultimately to get out and share it. But you don't know. You don't know the answers, and you don't always do the right thing. And I think that's a part of all of us. And sometimes you come upon the right thing in a really difficult way. One other scene. I'm going to read this one and one more. This is a scene where now Lila is working in this diner on Wall Street, and she goes home every night to this dingy little apartment on the Lower East Side. Not very far away at all, but millions of miles away in terms of the conversations that happen and the money divide and everything else. But she's just discovered a secret about this Wall Street banker who comes to frequent her diner. Lila arrived home to a glorious May evening. Vibrant swaths of magenta, tangerine, and rose striped the blue dusk sky like the swirls around the candy canes at Cohen's Sweet Shop on Rivington Street. The air carried a gentle breeze throughout the Lower East Side. Lila was so gleefully distracted with thoughts of Roderick and the Morgans that she circled her neighborhood several times before reaching her building. Rachel was playing stoop ball with a few of her friends. The brow under her raven ringlets was damp with the sweat of competition. Their building had the tallest stoop in the neighborhood, 7 steps in all, so it was a magnet for kids. Children were laughing and scampering after every stray ball that bounced down the sidewalk. The twins were unofficial neighborhood champs. Jonathan would wind his arm like a Yankee pitcher on opening night. He could go 20 points without missing a catch and finish a game with 100 points. Joshua had stopped playing a few years ago. "Hey, cuz," Jonathan called to Lila mid-pitch, his hair tousled mess, the sleeves of his work shirt rolled up to his elbows. "Your sister's gaining on me. She's out to take my title. It's war." "I bet on Rachel," Lila laughed. "Is that all my talent means to you?" asked Jonathan, grinning. "Sorry, Jonathan, but Rach is no slouch. We all better watch out for her. And would you mind making room for me to pass through the big game?" "Do we have to stop now?" moaned Rachel. "I'm having my best run." "Of course you don't," Rivka answered, arriving breathless at their stoop. She hung on to the iron railing, her ample breasts heaving. "I haven't seen your sister in weeks. We're going to do a little catch-up, so keep beating Jonathan, okay?" "Okay," agreed Rachel, grabbing the ball, not needing the extra encouragement. "Rivka," Lila hugged her friend, "so good to see you, but I'm late for dinner. Rosa will be waiting for me to help with the finishing touches." "Rosa definitely does not need your help in the cooking department," Rivka chuckled. "Now tell me, what's new, please? My life is one big bore right now. I need to come up with better fish stories for Joshua or move on. It's tragic. How's your crush?" Lila couldn't suppress a wide grin that unleashed her dimples. "See, there's news," exclaimed Rivka. "Tell me." "Okay, but let's go over to Feinberg's Hardware, away from Miss Big Ears over there," she gestured to Rachel. The two walked a few buildings down the block. They strode past Marcus's shoe store and Harold's cigar shop, sniffing wafts of sweet tobacco. They passed another set of kids playing hopscotch and a third playing stickball. Everyone was out tonight. After they sat down on Feinberg's steps, Lila blurted out the latest development. "Are you kidding me?" Rivka's emerald eyes nearly bulged out of their sockets. "He's a Morgan, flesh and blood of the richest man in the world, and he talks to you?" And that was part of what was going on at the time. There was a cynicism amongst a very small group of people about what went down on Wall Street, because it was very secretive. There were bankers down there. There was money made down there. There was a stock market everybody was talking about, but it was still pretty secretive, and it still is today. But it was even more so then, and yet there was this adoration of it. Like, it must be so amazing. You know, those guys making this money, what are they doing? What crazy things are going on down there? And until the market really crashed and things got really bad, there wasn't this notion of a connection between those things that went down there and how it was impacting a stoop ball game on the steps on Orchard Street. And just as a background to that, one of the women that I had interviewed and I talked to a lot of people about their experiences during the Great Depression was kind of a little bit Rachel, who was the little sister of Lila, the main character. And she used to tell me that, you know, they didn't have a lot of money, so they would have a ball, and this ball would be basically everybody's game, and it was stoop ball. And you'd find the stairs, and you basically throw the ball, catch it, and there'd be like these tournaments going on the streets. You know, you'd find a stick, you'd play stick ball. Whereas uptown on Park Avenue and so forth, you had all of the latest toys, the latest fashions, the latest everything, and it was a tremendous, tremendous difference, as again it is today, even more pronounced back then. But obviously there's a cost that comes with that difference on our economy, on people back then. And the bankers that ultimately perpetuate some of what happens don't always know what they're doing, and some do, and herein lies the problem. Her crush is a Morgan partner. In real life, there were 40 partners at Morgan Bank. He was the 41st in my book, but has a lot of the elements of the others. So this last scene I'm going to read will probably take you into today a little bit, but it was the afternoon, for real, of 1929, October, Tuesday, 1929, the 29th. And Roderick, the Morgan partner, had to go into the secret meeting at the New York Stock Exchange. Right now, if you imagine the triangle down on Wall Street, there's the stock exchange, there's the old Morgan Bank, which was the first big Morgan Bank, and then there's Federal Hall. It's kind of a triangle. Obviously, it was the same then. And for real, in the middle of this day, when the market was going crazy and crashing, there was a notice given to the Morgan Bank that there was going to be a secret meeting held at the New York Stock Exchange to talk about what to do. Bankers had several days before that, on Black Thursday, pooled lots of their money together and thought they could save the markets. And they did for a little bit, and the media said that was all great, and then they all plummeted again. And so now they're several days later, and they know that everything they've basically created and lied about is going to come crumbling down. So there's a secret meeting at the New York Stock Exchange to decide what to do. And it was told to people that were coming over from Morgan not to let anybody basically see them come over, because that would incite a riot. You know, imagine there's all these people down in the exchange, everybody's angry, and the actual, this was only reported much later, it wasn't reported at the time, the meeting that was held was actually held in secret. They went up the back stairs of the exchange to avoid being caught. The exchange was the last place Roderick wanted to be. It was just like his uncle to stay away from the fray, always in the shadows. He grabbed his overcoat and hat and followed Lamont. From across the lower lobby of Morgan, Roderick saw a cluster of men before the bank's doors, yelling at the Morgan guards with fists clenching stock certificates. Lamont said, "Not that way, out the back." The two men exited the bank through the same steel doors that normally opened for truckloads of gold bars. Once outside, they had no choice but to barge through the crowds to reach the back door of the exchange across the narrow street. Fortunately, there were less people on this side of the exchange than raging directly in front of it, but the task was still far from simple. Just when they reached the back of the exchange, two guards told them to wait outside so that people wouldn't spot two Morgan partners entering. "They might just kill you," said an exchange guard. Roderick adjusted his hat to cover his eyes and waited by Lamont. He was looking down at his shoes when a man wearing a gray overcoat and matching bowler hat marched up to him and punched him in the stomach. Roderick doubled over. "May you rot in hell," said the man, before he spit in Roderick's face and ran off. On that happy note, there was obviously a lot of visceral anger back then. We see that anger today. But when I started writing this book, it was the story, the notion of this young girl who really didn't know anything about any of this. Not about bankers, not about Wall Street, not about fighting, not about labor activists. You know, she just wanted to grow up in this America, have the dream that everyone talked about when they immigrated here, and that was all. And she comes upon some discoveries that she can't ignore, even though she tries really hard to. And that's a lot of the conflict in the book, is that, you know, sometimes you ignore until you can't. And what do we do at that moment of our humanity or our situation, our personal lives, you know, an aggregate situation for the country or whatever to stand up, and what's our internal struggle in doing that. So she does go through a lot of that, and I think today there's a lot of that a lot now. I mean, there's a lot of anger. There's Matt's quote. There's all of the stuff that we know has been imposed upon the economy, on the conditions of this country, by virtue of criminal activity, by virtue of fraud, by virtue of inflating the value of things that shouldn't be inflated. And what we're seeing now is really no different. The details might be different, but the mechanisms, the people are all the same, really. They're just, you know, like Nancy's here instead of her grandfather. You know, it's like Jamie Dimon is here instead of Jack Morgan, but in a worse way. And I think that's also the impetus for learning from our past and hoping that, you know, maybe we can bring the good parts of what happened in that past forward, because not all of the bankers at this time got what they should have gotten. None of them were actually arrested. None of them were actually tried for securities fraud or anything like that at the time, but
Sounds familiar.
which is very familiar, which I know Matt will talk about. But we did have a situation where there was an understanding that the country had to be protected. And that in the midst of the Great Depression that followed the stock market crash in 1929, the foundation of the country, the core of the financial system had to be protected vis-a-vis the population. And that was part of the reason why they split up the banks ultimately in 1933. It was the idea that you can't be doing fraudulent things and then crash the whole economy, however it is that happens, and either A, get away with it, or B, get to continue doing it with our help, i.e. the government's help. And so back then they had that distinction. They had the Glass-Steagall Act passed, which divided banks and basically slapped back not all their speculative activities, but at least gave the population protections that we don't have now, which is a sad lack of historical understanding in today's world. But all of that aside, going through it at the time, and if you can imagine going back and seeing kind of a simpler world as a person just coming here and figuring it out with their heart, with their head, struggling between family, struggling between the wealthy and the poor and everything else, you get a sense for how we are really not that different from how we were 82 years ago. So that. I just want to say one thing about Matt, in addition, before he starts responding. No, it's okay. When he wrote the piece about the vampire squid, which was my old firm, I had so many calls about him. And we didn't actually know each other at the time. It was sort of like, who is this? I knew his work, but I didn't know him. We hadn't had a personal conversation, and I think I had so many calls about that piece and about this guy that I reached out, and I'm just glad to say we have become friends, and I deeply admire this man's work, and I'm sure you guys all do too. So.
Well, that was great. I have a lot to say about Nomi, but just a couple of really quick things before I start. First of all, Rich, I'm really sorry for stealing your title. I didn't, I saw it. I thought that sounds catchy. I'll take that. The second thing, before we go on, I just want to say how cool it is for me personally to be able to appear at the Strand. I've been buying books from those bins outside since I was like this tall, and like literally half the books on my bookshelves come from the store in one form or another, either this one or the one that used to be downtown. So my wife and I used to go there every weekend and come out with stacks this big. So this is a big honor for me, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm glad you all came out tonight. This is great for me to be able to come out and talk about Nomi and Nomi's book, just to explain a little bit about where I'm coming from with regard to Nomi and what I think she meant to this period to a lot of journalists like me. I just want to tell my story about how I came to know her. I think my story was kind of typical for a lot of political journalists up until 2008. Most people who cover politics in national American politics really didn't know anything about economics at all. Our whole modus operandi for covering politics was covering the economy, was to look at the stock market and inflation and maybe unemployment figures, and that was it. If the stock market was up, we would say the economy was good, and if the inflation was low, the economy was good, and that was really about it. Most people didn't understand anything else. I can tell you that with 100% certainty that the people on the campaign trail who cover politics for a living know absolutely nothing about economics. And one of the sort of precipitating incidents for me. Is there something we can do about that? Feedback? No? Okay. Does everyone remember the whole drill baby drill speech that McCain did in the summer of 2008? Well, I was covering McCain. I was on the McCain campaign plane, and I remember we were in Kenner, Louisiana. And he was sort of unveiling a new version of that speech, and of course, what McCain was talking about was the surge in gas prices that summer. Everyone remember gas prices went through the roof, and he was basically saying, "Oh, if we just drilled in the Gulf of Mexico, then those, somehow that would magically make gas prices go down." So he gives this speech, and all the reporters are filing back into our little, private prison, which is the campaign plane, and one of the TV reporters is like, "Oh, McCain, what a jerk," as if drilling in the Gulf of Mexico has anything to do with why gas prices are going up. And I kind of turned to him and I kind of raised my hand and I said, "Does anybody here actually know why gas prices are going up?" And it was like the cartoons, where the crickets come in, like literally nobody knew. And I kind of turned to one of these, another reporter who was sitting next to me, and I'm like, "Doesn't that make us all frauds?" And he's like, "Dude, you're just figuring that out now?" So there was that, So then the crash happens, like, a couple of months later, and suddenly this whole army of ignoramuses who don't know anything about the economy are suddenly given these assignments, like, go figure out what just happened, and then tell everybody else about it like you're an expert. And so I was one of those people who was like given this daunting assignment of explaining all of these labyrinthine, machinations that led to the financial crisis of 2008. And I was one of these people who didn't even know how to balance a checkbook. So I'm starting from square one. And I remember I started making a whole bunch of calls to people in the industry. And I remember like the first time somebody explained credit default swaps to me, and they were saying, oh, two financial institutions are basically they sign a contract with each other, and if X person defaults on his loan, then this bank gets the full value of the loan. But if he doesn't default on it, then this person continues paying that party a regular payment every month. And I'm sitting here listening to this and like, that sounds just like gambling. Is that economics? And these guys on Wall Street who I were calling, they were saying, no, you don't understand. It's very sophisticated. It's not just gambling. It's a mechanism for lessening risk. And they had all this verbiage that they were cloaking all of this in, but it sounded really fishy to me. And then then it got into collateralized debt obligations. And the more people explained this to me, I was talking to them and I was saying, so let me get this straight. So you take a whole bunch of subprime loans that are basically worthless or junk rated, they're extremely risky, and then you somehow sprinkle a bunch of magic dust on them and they turn into AAA rated loans that you can sell to pension funds and Dutch trade unions and other victims all around the globe, and they're like, yeah, and then I'm like, well, that sounds just like the guys on the street who sell Prada bags and Gucci watches. They're not really, how is that any different from just crime? And they're like, no, you don't understand. It's economics. It's a risk management tool. It creates liquidity. That's the phrase they always use. It creates liquidity. So your instinct is to like run with a headline that just says craziest shit imaginable. Like this can't possibly be happening. But I think like a lot of reporters, I was hesitant because most of us had never met any people from that world. None of us had any actual access to people like Lloyd Blankfein or Jamie Dimon. We didn't get to talk to them. I mean, even presidential candidates, most of us have gotten to sit down and talk to these people, but we don't have access to the captains of finance, and at least political reporters don't. And so we didn't really know how it worked, and so a lot of us were really hesitant to make judgments about it. And then you add to the fact that the entire financial press was treating what happened as just sort of a grotesque accident and, a 1,000-year flood. This is just, economics. These things happen. It wasn't crime. It wasn't fraud. It was just a whole bunch of people who made some bad judgments about the market. And these are seemingly smart people on television, and there's a whole army of people on CNBC who are acting like this isn't crazy and that it isn't crime. And so you hesitate because you don't have that personal experience. And so what was really needed was for somebody from that world to come forward and explain to us, yes, this was nuts. It's exactly as crazy as it seems like. And moreover, let me tell you a little bit about what these people are like so you can understand the motivations in the background. And that's really what I think Nomi's role has been in this entire fiasco. She was one of the first sort of first person witnesses to history to come forward and to confirm the superficial conclusions that all these outsiders were drawing, but we couldn't know for sure unless we had somebody who was actually on the inside explaining a lot of this to us. And I had it was shortly after, I think, my Goldman piece came out. I forget who called who first, but we ended up meeting in New York in a Jewish deli in the Diamond District. Yeah, they closed it, the Dairy Luncheon. Does anyone know that place? And we sat, and Nomi basically, she ran through the history of her experiences at, particularly at Bear Stearns and Goldman, and she told me a lot about what, her career had been like and what her apprehensions were and why she ended up leaving. And for me, it was, as a reporter, it was invaluable because, not just confirming intellectually what all these instruments were and how they worked and why they blew up, but it was also what the rooms looked like where these deals went down, what the attitude was of the people who were doing these deals. From on the outside, one comes to the conclusion that these people must have been looking at numbers. There must have been internal objections, people in the risk management departments coming forward and saying, dude, we can't do this, it's going to blow up the company. And there must have been people who said, forget about that, we'll worry about that later. And it wasn't until I met Nomi that I realized that I had somebody to tell me, yes, firsthand, yes, this did happen, yes, these people were routinely ignored, and that's why a lot of these disasters happened. So all of this, there weren't a whole lot of people from this world who came forward to tell us what it was like on the inside, and so she's really an invaluable resource in that regard. And I think what she's able to do with Black Tuesday, there are a lot of things that we can't imagine except in the realm of fiction because they couldn't possibly happen in reality. Like, for instance, we're never going to have a fraud trial of a Jamie Dimon or a Lloyd Blankfein in this country. It's just these people are not going to be dragged into court and forced to answer for their crimes. And make no mistake about it, this is another key point that Nomi, her experience brings out and she bears out in the book. There were a lot of people who were trying to say that what happened in the crash was the work of a few bad apples here on the side and underlings, that the guys up at the top couldn't possibly have been aware that they were selling, mismarked instruments knowingly and unloading them on customers. That's complete crap. None of this could have happened without the full and total participation of the guys at the very top of these companies, and she makes that plain. But her novel comes to a crescendo at the end, and there's a trial scene where a character, the Jack Morgan character, who's sort of like titan of industry, is actually dragged into court for fraud and forced to come face to face with the people who bought these these dicey investment trusts, which are very similar to the CDOs of our modern time, although they were a little bit more primitive. And that's exactly what we're not going to see now. Has everyone heard about this foreclosure deal that the AGs are cooking up now, the state attorneys general? That's going to be sort of a unified settlement that's going to give the banks immunity from all kinds of legal liability. Well, it's precisely because of that deal that we're not going to have gigantic class action lawsuits of defrauded investors who are going to drag these guys into court and prove that they all committed fraud, that they knowingly disguised the crappiness of these loans as they were selling them as AAA rated securities around the world. We're never going to get that scene inside a courtroom. We're never going to see that evidence dragged out. It's been years now. Nobody has gone to jail for any of this stuff, and it's just not going to happen unless more pressure is brought to bear from these people downtown. We're just never going to see that scene, except in Nomi's book, and it's a great place to come, face to face with what the evidence would be if we were actually able to see it. And so I think it's an invaluable opportunity for all of us, and the novel is a really cool thing, and I think everybody should read it. So, all right, so who's going to talk?
Let me ask you both a question.
Sure.
Let's say after Freud, novels have become about psychology. So I want to ask you guys about the psychology of Wall Street. Because when you go to Occupy Wall Street, a lot of people are frustrated and pissed off at what has went down in the last 7 to 8 years. So the question is, tell us, Nomi, about the villain in your character. And Matt, Taibbi, someone has said in order to work at the highest levels of Wall Street, you have to be a sociopath. I mean, that's a direct quote. What is your understanding of people's motives and people's psychology over the last 5 years and what's gone on? So in the novelistic sense and in the real life sense.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think I said they were sociopaths, but because there has to be a clear separation of how you act and who you think you are at those top levels, and not because they're CEOs, not because you're running the Morgan Bank, but because of everything that made you able to take that position. And I continue to think about this just in the more psychological, emotional sense. Are you a sociopath first, and that's how you get to that position? Like, is it a latent quality? No, I mean, and when you get there, it sort of flushes out. Or when you get the power, is that sort of like water on a plant, and I don't know, or is it something that it's a latent human thing or inhuman thing? But one of the things that struck me in looking at the history of the Morgan Bank and Jack Morgan, who's J.P. Morgan's son, is that when he was actually called to trial in 1933, and this is for real, in Washington at the Pecora Commission trials, it looked into all of what Wall Street had done up until the 29 crash. He was like really steely and really calm, and the way the media portrayed it at the time, he's so cool and he's so calm and he's so, and there was a little circus mini girl or something that stepped on his lap, and he was so nice to her, and the way, like, after all of what happened, there was this turning around of the media almost embracing the same people. They were also running headlines about, sensationally, the Pecora trials. So it was just always this weird sort of dichotomy of, they're up there and so forth. And what I did in the novel, and I don't want to give away the scene because it's not, things happen, there are twists and stuff, but the Jack Morgan character really is based on Jack Morgan. The Morgan Bank really is Morgan Bank, and there's a lot of elements, I think, of crime. Forget calling it securities, or forget labeling it as anything complicated. Lying about something for profit, that is very simple to achieve. It's as simple as a signature on a document. It's as simple as two separate documents that say different things. It doesn't have to be a complicated CDO, credit link, derivative times a million. Like, it doesn't need to be that. The mechanism for pulling one over on anyone who buys this stuff requires that same sense of separatism from the people that are buying it. And to me, that's a sociopathic quality. Now in here, and again, not giving away the plot, but there are other elements that flesh out the sociopathic quality of the villain, which you can read. But I think that the elements of one kind of crime versus another kind of crime are pretty much the same.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, first, I think one of the first ways you have to answer that question is to identify what happened. Like, what's a typical crime that went on during this period, this recent period? Is take a banker is going to sell $250 million of mortgage-backed securities to, let's say, the state pension fund of Minnesota. So let's all be clear about what this is. Some guy who knows he's selling a gigantic load of extremely risky subprime mortgages that are likely to blow up. He's selling a whole bunch of crap to a state pension fund. So that's the retirement savings of working class people, janitors, teachers, policemen, firemen. This guy is going to basically steal from old ladies and old people. That's what he's doing when he's selling this big block of mortgage-backed securities to a state pension fund or to CalPERS or whatever. And in order to do that, I mean, you're going to make an enormous amount of money, and you're never going to see those people. And all you got to do is sign a few documents and hit a few strokes on your computer, and you're emotionally, I think, right? I mean, these guys are completely dissociated from the results of their activities. And I think a lot of them, they came to genuinely believe in the righteousness of what they were doing. They believed that somehow this was, the survival of the fittest, that somehow all this trading, this capitalist activity was weeding out the weak, and it was going to create liquidity and somehow ultimately help the economy in the end. But the reality is what they were doing is just stealing from old people and the weak. And there's no way to do that unless you completely cut off your conscience and morality. I mean, I think it gets back to that in that famous experiment where people are told to turn the dial and that they're going to hear the screams in the other room, and what the results show is that people tend to do that as long as an authority figure tells them that it's okay. And I think that's what went on in this community. There was a mantra that kind of existed generally that this stuff was all right, and
it was the way you made money.
Right.
It wasn't just all right. It was your job.
Right. You had to, right? So
we'd love to hear from you guys, so we're going to circulate a mic, and if you could just ask a concise question, and please speak into the mic because you're being recorded. Thank you.
Hi. Well, this is a really awesome honor, so thank you for doing this. My question is, speaking about training for which you get into these jobs, what part of the problem is, rooted in the fact that academic economics is sort of has this inherent problem in which professors or people write papers, but they don't have to disclose who funded the papers. So they could write like documents about, currency exchanging is so much, this is great invention, but they don't have to actually disclose that Forex, the currency trader, is the one that sponsored the paper. And how, if that's the case, do we turn that back? How can we force academia to disclose information if they're getting funded by certain financial institutions when they write papers?
I think your question is part of the bigger issue of the transparency notion of what happens on Wall Street, and whether it's the papers that people write about it or the articles or whatever, and what actually goes on. And there's still a lot of sort of cloak and dagger as to what goes on actually every day, and a lot of the documentation that does comes out is very difficult to sort of process and doesn't necessarily have all the information that you need. And therefore, if you're in academia and you decide, my bigger problem actually with academia or certain academic papers is that those people don't necessarily live through the things they're talking about. So they'll be talking about currency swaps or credit derivatives, and they've never structured one. I don't believe, I don't believe anyone in Washington knows what a swap is, and you don't have to in day-to-day life, and that's part of what Lila discovers in the book. You don't need to know a lot, but if you're making decisions and you're enabling conditions that allow whatever it is you don't understand to devastate the economy, then it's your responsibility to get out a spreadsheet and just look at some numbers, or find a person or do anything that gives you some understanding and at least have a basis for what you're deciding upon, which does not exist in any of the people I've spoken with in Washington.
Yeah. I mean, just quickly, the only thing I'll add to that is that it's not just at the university level. I think there's been a lot written, and it was an inside job about how the banks are sponsoring academics, and they're behind a lot of those research papers. But there's a tremendous movement afoot for all the banks that are getting heavily involved in sponsoring secondary education, even elementary school education. If you go into the communities all across the country, there are a lot of these deals where a bank will come to a community that's struggling financially, and they'll say, here's $5 million for your school system, but in return we want you to dissolve your teachers union, or we want this or that. And it's kind of like the IMF World Bank structural adjustment method, where we give you a whole bunch of money, and in return we want your ideological cooperation on this X, Y, and Z.
Or your soul.
Right, exactly. And they're very, very keen on doing that, and I think it shows how far-reaching their vision is about society. They don't have any immediate benefit to doing that, and they're spending a lot of money on it, and that tells you that they have a very, very broad vision for how they want to impact the world.
And keep the information out.
Right.
Well,
Keep it, yeah.
Oh, hi. Sorry. You two are heroes, so thank you very much. And this is sort of to both of you. Do you think we can stop them at the New Hampshire primary before they turn this country into kind of Mad Max nightmare world?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that Occupy Wall Street is really bringing out is that there aren't any obvious electoral solutions to a lot of this. I mean, I think we've kind of gone the route of trying to fix this at the ballot box because, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, if you look historically, the Democrats actually have probably dirtier hands in terms of deregulating this mess than the Republicans do. And if you look at what happened in Dodd-Frank, the negotiations last year, that was a fiasco as well. There are a lot of well-meaning people in Washington. There were 33 votes to start breaking up the banks and the Brown-Kaufman bill amendment, but it's not quite enough. I don't think there's any. I mean, do you think there's a solution out there?
No,
at the presidential level.
Well, at the presidential level, definitely. I mean, the fact that President Obama has Tim Geithner as the Treasury Secretary, right there is it's a rubber stamp to the idea of subsidizing, bailing out, whatever term you use for the way Wall Street acts and the way Wall Street will continue to act. It's a big rubber stamp status quo. Let's not touch anything, because the Treasury Secretary is not about to turn around and say, oops, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have really backed Bank of America just because they bought all this crap from Countrywide and Merrill Lynch, which, by the way, I said they could do. Between my role at the New York Fed and Ben Bernanke at the role of the Fed head, they're not going to turn around and ever admit a mistake, which by the way is part of the whole sociopathicness. There's the culpability at the most powerful level, where you keep, say, banks big, you keep them structurally as they are. You agree to large mergers that shouldn't ever happen because they are very unstable for the rest of the economy. Those people have no incentive, interest, ability to consider anything they've done a mistake.
I mean, look at what happened, right? You had this mess that was because of concentration of capital, and what was their solution to it?
You concentrate more.
They concentrated it more. They took the residue from all these banks and they jammed them together and made them even more dangerous. So.
And today, actually, they're re-rubber stamping that. Bank of America, my favorite negative bank, is today. I changed, but is taking a lot of the stuff that was toxic from Merrill Lynch, which was something they purchased in the wake of the financial crisis component of 2008, and they're basically putting it on their deposit side. So because banks are not just big but complex, they can be like, all this stuff over here that we don't understand, it's going to lose money, we're just going to mix it up with deposits, and that way you really have to back us in case all of that fails. In case you didn't do that enough the first time. Like, we're doing it today, like today, this the Fed is approving this. So it's not only that we've learned nothing, we continue to, we're going backwards right now, I think.
Right, and then both parties have an equal hand in that.
Both parties.
Quick comment, when people with the protests are accused of being conspiracy theorists, I wish the screen read, this is what they mean. Thanks, yeah.
Well, yeah, I actually, that just dovetails pretty well. I was going to ask just about stuff that financial services companies are doing now. Like there seems to be all this volatility in the market. Like there's this weird thing that Goldman tried to do with Facebook. There seems to be some kind of tech bubble emerging, and there appear to be investment banks shorting entire countries in Europe. Unless I misunderstand that, it's very disturbing to me that you would bet on the destruction of Italy. That's I wouldn't want to win that bet, but I don't know if you have any views about that.
Yeah, can I?
Go ahead.
I mean, that stuff is such a classic example of what modern Wall Street is all about. It's like, take the example of Greece, right? Like, Goldman goes into Greece and they sell this country a gigantic raft of interest rate swaps to basically, what do interest rate swaps do? You have a country that has a whole bunch of debt. They can't afford to pay it right now, and it's just really just a mechanism to push the debt into the future so that the current spate of politicians doesn't have to deal with it, and the future generation of politicians has a big bomb that's going to go off in their face. So it's basically this symbiotic deal between Wall Street and the sitting politicians. It's like, we'll lend you a bunch of money now so that future politicians can give us a big bribe later. Well, of course, Goldman does this deal, right, which is going to enormously destabilize Greece. It makes their long-term outlook extremely negative. And what do right away? They set up a mechanism to short Greece. Because they themselves have sold them this stuff that is going to blow up. And that's an exact repeat of what happened in the mortgage industry, where they were selling this stuff, then they turned right around and bet against it. And then when they broke their bookies doing that and couldn't get their bets paid off, they made us pay it off through the bailouts. And that's exactly what's going on with this Euro bailout right now. They're going to get somebody else to pay off those bets.
And actually, again, in terms of history repeating itself, that day I was telling you about Black Thursday, 6 big bankers got into a room and they decided to pool up the market. They put in their own money. It wasn't federal money, but still put in. One of those was the head of what was Chase at the time. Now it's JP Morgan Chase. It was a Morgan Bank, there was Chase, they've gotten together. He was in this room and he's like, I'll pledge this. It's, our stock is going to be worth it. We're going to put it in the market. All these, little people are going to buy stuff. Everything is going to be great. And meanwhile, he set up like 5 companies in like Canada run by, the names of his relatives. And he's shorting the stock, right? This guy's name's Al Wiggins. He's shorting the stock. He's in the room. They call the New York Times right after that. Wall Street Journal, banker saved the day, blah, blah, blah. The real headlines all over the place. And he's off shorting the stock. And a year later, when the depression starts to really take hold, he's in Europe trying to figure out how to basically get money out of the European side of the crash. Right? So it's exactly the same. It's make money where you can. When it falls apart, like move on. I mean, that's kind of the modus. And again, it's not complicated. And I think one of the good things that's coming out of the Occupy Wall Street movement is that it's showing you don't have to know every single mechanic of every single detail of how this happens. You just have to know that the impact, that the ultimate result is bad, and that there is a connection. And I think that I show it in here through Lila, just understanding that at a base level. Like, what happens if one person makes one bad decision on one bad deal, and how that not just escalates in financial world and in economy, but how that escalates in people's real lives every day at home, in their family, in terms of mortality. And so there's so many connections.
Thank you, Matt, for letting everybody know about how Goldman propped up Greece, then only to short it. Really accurate portrayal. Naomi, Milton Friedman said that the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression, and if you go along with that line of reasoning, that the Federal Reserve constricted or didn't allow for the monetary supplies to increase. If you look at this current crisis, would you say that the Federal Reserve bears responsibility as well because of how they enabled the banks to go ahead and have such an easy supply of money to lend out that would allow for the mortgage industry? Government bears its responsibility for creating the regulations, but what burden would you put on the Federal Reserve for that? And would you propose the abolishing of the Federal Reserve? And if you would, what would you put in its place?
Okay, this could be a topic for, it's an excellent question, so I'm just going to give a very short answer, though we could honestly talk about this a lot, and it's a really good question. The Federal Reserve and Wall Street are symbiotic, right? There is, printing money, making the currency cheap, giving out cheap loans is what has pumped a lot of the toxic asset market. It's what's pumped a lot of speculation. It's what's allowed banks to survive when they shouldn't be solvent. On the other hand, it's banks that are using that money to speculate and leverage and do all these other things. So it's almost like the nature in which the Fed has enabled Wall Street to do what Wall Street does in its current form is the danger. So it is totally a symbiotic danger. Back in the Great Depression, and I take issue with Ben Bernanke's whole "I'm a Great Depression scholar" thing. I mean, I know he's written a lot of papers and he's spent a lot of time, and that's fine. But again, to go back to a personal situation, one of the bankers sitting in that room, not the guy who was shorting a stock, another one, was also had a first class A seat at the New York Fed at the time. So the head of what was then Citigroup, City National, Charles Mitchell, was also sitting at the New York Fed. He actually, and this doesn't come up in Ben Bernanke's papers, he was actually trying to get the Fed to keep rates low into the crash of 1929, to keep money cheap and keep the speculation going, because his bank was going to be screwed if rates went up when he couldn't handle that. And he had a lot of stock in his bank and didn't want that to happen. So he basically increased the bubble that became the crash personally. I mean, other people, but you know, he had a personal impact. And right now we have Jamie Dimon, who's the head of JP Morgan Chase, who's sitting at the same seat, the same spot at the New York Fed, able to have the conversations, you know, with Tim Geithner over there, you know, to talk about we need rates low now, we need cheap loans now. You know, if we don't, the economy is going to get worse, or whatever conversations are happening.
I need $30 billion in guarantees to buy
for
Bear
Stearns.
Stearns, right?
And I'll just keep that forever, by the way. Let's never talk about the fact that I only own Bear Stearns because the Fed, i.e. us, are, you know, financing it. And the Treasury Department's all okay with that. So it's not, the fact that the Fed can both regulate banks, is allowed to tell them how to behave or not behave, to merge or not to merge, which they never say not, they always say to, and print money when they screw up, is a completely, you know, bad economic policy. It's morally hazardous, and all of those things. So having the Fed be in control of regulating the banking system when it also is allowed to save it when it screws up is just not good for the rest of the economy.
Let me just add one really quick thing about to that. I mean, one of the criticisms that people like Nomi and I got when we talked about all this stuff as well, you know, you shouldn't criticize people at Goldman and JP Morgan, because these guys are really smart. They earn their money because they're the smartest guys in the world, and they deserve to get all that money that they earn because they're just so smart. If you're borrowing money, billions of dollars from the Fed at 0%, and then you're going out and lending it at 5% to the rest of us, or 25% in a credit card,
Or 29%.
or 29%, and that's how you're making your money. What kind of, does it take a genius to do that?
Right.
I mean, God, I mean, a 3-year-old could make $1 billion if you have that kind of setup. It's criminal what these guys, the Fed is basically a gigantic ATM machine that all these banks get to use. They get free money, and then they lend it all out to us at market rates, and that's their business. That's how they all, that the Washington called this recapitalizing the banks after the crash. And that's all it is free money, go get yourselves well, and then charge us the market rate.
And there's a reason why there's not a lot of money that comes back out. There's a reason why it's hard to negotiate a mortgage, or renegotiate a student loan, or to get a small business loan, because they wouldn't want to do that if they can basically be getting money for free and using it in any capacity. There's no attachment, there's no obligation, there's no economic obligation to actually spread it around. And there wasn't back then, except then the issue was there were more farmers than other kinds of businessmen, and there was a lot of conversation, which doesn't happen in Ben Bernanke's papers, about how they were trying to suppress loans to the farmers, which ultimately also helped create the Great Depression. And now it's, you know, it's not farmers, it's kind of everybody. And farmers also, but it's the same mechanism. It's the we keep it low, we restrain when we have problems, we get bailed out when we have problems, and whatever happens on the outside, it's an accident of nature. It's the economy, it's the cycle, it's the way things are. Yeah.
I have a question. I know what it's like for a typical day to work in a bookstore. What's it like to work for Demos, for a think tank? How's it structured?
Okay. Now, Nomi works for Demos too. She's a senior fellow. My typical day is I have a series of long-term projects I'm working that are related on culture and politics, and I work on those. But I also follow what's going on a daily basis, whether it be Occupy Wall Street, whether it be election issues, and I'll write and comment and research on those. So there's no typical day per se, but that's what I typically do.
It's also very much, I mean, what you do is, it's also very much about what's happening right now and how these policies, whether they're on democracy, whether they're economic policies, are impacting people right now. And rather than just saying they are, actually coming up with, you know, good solid information that people can use when they talk about the issues.
This has been an absolutely incredible evening. Thank you all very, very much. My question gets back to something Matt said, that we'd never see these individuals prosecuted, and I hear that. But Eric Schneiderman and Beau Biden, and there is a group of people who are trying to defend the bondholders and to make sure that doesn't happen. Given everything that's going on with Occupy Wall Street, where Americans are becoming interested and informed, thanks to you, and I hope we see an awful lot more of you all on TV and everywhere. What can we be doing, and how can we institute some sort of change to see these people prosecuted, and also to have a better future all the way around?
That's a good question. I mean, the obvious answer is write letters, protest, all of these things. I think politicians are rapidly becoming aware that if they sweep this whole foreclosure thing under the rug, that they're playing with fire. I mean, there's 4 million people already out in the streets because they lost their homes, and that's just lighting a fuse. If they decide not to take anybody to jail for all that stuff, and also give them immunity from civil liability, I think they're making a huge mistake. And politicians, we saw the Attorney General in California has already doubled back. I think they're very, very sensitive to public pressure right now. Obviously, we have a good one here in New York who's already not going to jump on board with that. But if you're from another state, I think they're listening. So, letters show public support. I think all that stuff is.
The Attorney General route actually is. I mean, even though they're not at that level, the Senate or in Washington per se, I think the collective pressure that they can exude if they hear what's going on and they're doing their jobs, prosecuting at the foreclosure fraud level, and also taking that all the way up to the CEO level, because that fraud is something that remains in every single asset that is created all the way up the line, from the one home and the one mortgage that might have been fraudulently created to the mega CDO wrapped synthetic, whatever thing that's on the other side of that. The fraud continues. It doesn't stop because it's passed to the next level. But I think that I used to say the same thing. Write your congressman, and there is something to be said for that. I think the Occupy Wall Street movement is a visible movement, so help to that actually as a representative movement of everybody is useful. And also the Attorney General route, I've been finding more and more is a good accessible route as well.
Just really quick on that, one of the narratives that the banks are trying to push about the foreclosure thing is that this is all about paperwork. This is, we didn't transfer the deeds properly. That's all this thing is about. That's not what it's all about. This is a massive systematic cover-up where what we're talking about is a gigantic industry-wide effort at selling crap as Chanel No. 5 to investors all around. And if I think a couple of AGs like Schneiderman they're on the scent. They recognize that there is a lot of political hay to be made. I mean, if you go down that route with investigating securitization, that whole aspect of all of this, they could be making cases till the next century, basically. And I think a lot of smart attorneys general are realizing that's where the money is, and a little push and they'll go there.
There have been some prosecutions, but they're odd. If a CEO or a member of a board of directors has a fiduciary responsibility to his shareholders, he'll always tell you that. So if I were a shareholder and my CEO, when he was about to sell this junk, said, "Oh, but it'll hurt that little old lady in the pension fund in Minneapolis," I could sue him. I could sue him because he has to put my fiduciary responsibility first. And if the guy is decent, as I'm talking to the kind of people who are decent, what they'll say is, make it against the law. Then I won't have to do it. In other words, stop me before I kill again. So there have been some suits, but think back to Enron. The suits were not Enron for raising the price of electricity in California to the point that it broke the state and ruined the educational system, but only when you kept secrets from other shareholders, when you tried to pass it off on the shareholders. So it was only on behalf of shareholders that suits have been brought. I mean, that's really a shameful system. These guys will tell you, I'm not even allowed to think about the common good.
Yeah, but I would
I'm not trying to justify them. We just have to control them.
I would quibble with that only in the sense that what these guys were doing was criminal. It was fraud. It was against the law, and by doing it was against the law. I mean, if you're taking a gigantic batch of subprime mortgages from Countrywide, which you know is a criminal organization that is giving out fraudulent loans.
How they're performing. You know this. You have information that you are not moving along. So you also know that.
Right. So you know that, and then you're knowingly unloading them on people and not disclosing those facts. You're committing a crime, and that's incurring a much bigger liability than potential liability than missing out on the profits by not selling that thing. So I would argue that they created a much bigger problem for their shareholders by doing this than they would have by not doing it.
And under securities fraud laws, a lot of this stuff could be prosecuted. The whole reason the SEC was created was to investigate was to basically keep the kinds of trusts and the kinds of weird things where we were selling Chanel or calling it Chanel and selling whatever else was inside it. That was basically the SEC's job, was to protect the public from public fraud, from the securities that were created by these institutions that impact the public being fraudulent. So it's a really, I don't get to prosecute this stuff, but I mean it's much less complicated than they make it out to be.
What about SOC? Since it's the same thing.
Yes. Well, someone kind of asked a related question about solutions, and your answer kind of scares me a little bit because a lot of what your books are about is how these solutions aren't working, right? So, these solutions
don't get adopted.
Right, like presidential.
We think they could work, I think there's some
not.
basic solutions. The question: do you protect the economy, the general population? Do you protect the banking institutions?
My question more is though, doesn't there need to be a shift in the way we view these things though? Because I think a lot of the problem is, like Matt mentions in his book, that this isn't seen as criminality by everybody. And so what can we do to kind of change the mind state of our country where we actually see this as outright criminality? Because I feel like, I feel like that's a lot of the problem.
And that's probably on the media more than anything, right? I mean, I think.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of the media said that they've committed securities fraud. Securities fraud is illegal. They've committed illegal acts. They should be prosecuted and penalized.
Yeah, we don't see a lot of that. But as regards solutions, I think like there's going to be a huge debate down the road about things that need to be done, and the right is going to have its traditional solution of deregulation, and the other side is going to say let's have more regulation. But I think even before we get there's a lot of really obvious steps when we have to end this sort of unhealthy plutocratic symbiotic relationship between government and Wall Street that neither side agrees on. I don't think anybody on the right or the left agrees that our tax dollars should be going to pay Lloyd Blankfein's bonus, right? I mean nobody agrees to that. Nobody believes that Stevie Cohen or George Soros or John Paulson should be paying half the tax rate of a fireman or a teacher. I think that's something that everybody can agree upon. So there are a lot of things, break up the banks, a lot of things that are obvious solutions, and then there's the more complicated policy discussion down the road.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wrote a novel instead of a nonfiction this time around was because you sometimes have to take a break from like yelling about the solutions for like almost however many years I've been doing this. It was sort of like let me go into at least another time, another period, look at this a different way, touch a human side of it, because the solutions aren't that difficult either. It's the will to get there.
Right.
But there's so much money. That's the will problem. Right.
Hello. Hi. My name is George. I've been down to Occupy Wall Street a number of times, and my contribution is in a pictorial. I'd like to hand it to you. It made Meet the Press in their first 15 seconds of last 2 Sundays ago. I hung that. That's a skeleton holding a placard saying, "Throw me some crumbs," and I think it's how the 99% certainly feel. It's been very well photographed. My question, though, I'm trying to get the group down there to focus on what I think are the two most important overarching initiatives, which Dylan Radigan seems to have one covered, and that's campaign finance reform. But I think that's going to be a really difficult thing to do, a constitutional amendment. It's got to be carefully written with, tricky parameters. And the worst part is that we need both of our illustrious politicians to vote on it. And now, since the debt ceiling crisis, when they played political chicken with each other, we don't seem to have any confidence in either one of them. So my question to you, it's a question sort of, is do you think that campaign finance reform is one of the best ways to go about fixing what's wrong with our government? Or do we also need to actually change our voting system from single vote into something like score voting to level the playing field so that third and fourth party candidates will have an equal chance to win this and we'll be able to actually vote instead of being forced to feel that we have to vote for the Democrat or the Republican? We'll be able to actually vote for anybody that we want to and everybody that we want to and pick the guys who are the more generally preferred moderate centrists when they're not even on the ballot now. So that's sort of a question.
Well,
Thank you.
Yeah, I think just a real simple answer to that. Yeah, if we get money out of politics, that leaves real issues and real solutions and real activities in politics. And so, the campaign finance reform, the fact that we went in again, this is another thing in the last few years, we go in the opposite direction of what makes sense to be more palatable for the general population. And the Supreme Court decision regarding campaign finance reform is just another example of a recent happening of that. So if the people that run are, require the money that comes in from whether it's corporate sponsorship or Wall Street, and President Obama this year, his second largest group contributor is the financial industry. So if they're keeping your job, you're gonna sort of do what you need to do to stay in power, and so that definitely should be disconnected.
So how do you build a cap? Just really quickly on that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
My own personal experience from covering the Dodd-Frank bill. I mean, when I was down in the Senate at that time, really interesting statistic, the financial services industry had 2,000 lobbyists in the halls of Congress during that bill. The other side, which was like Americans for Financial Reform, had 60 volunteer lobbyists. And I remember very distinctly being in one senator's office, actually it was one of our senators, and not having room to stand in the waiting room because there were so many industry lobbyists in the waiting room. So the problem of money in this whole, look, there was a lot of reforms that got passed in the Dodd-Frank bill despite this avalanche of money that got thrown at all of these members of Congress, which just shows you how, it was what they were asking for was so wrong, and the other side was so appealing to whatever was left of the conscience of these congressional members, that they actually did do a few things despite the fact that all the money was on one side and none of it was on the other side. So I think if you can get at least even half the money out, you'll start to see a lot of movement, and I think that's.